In the fall of 2017, in the quiet rolling hills of Ambrose County, a single number saved 1,400 families. That number was 28. It was not the winning ticket for a state lottery, nor was it the designated highway leading to a new factory. It was the pounds-per-acre surplus yield of dark, pungent honey from a 40-acre field everyone, including the man with a doctorate in soil science, had declared worthless. The story of that number and the field that produced it is not about honey. It's about the difference between looking at a place and truly seeing it. And it begins, as these things often do, with a long, slow crisis that everyone saw coming, but no one knew how to stop. Let me tell you about Ambrose County, because you need to understand the stakes. It isn't a place of grand industry or coastal wealth. It is 680 square miles of Appalachian foothills, a place where wealth is measured in productive acreage and the health of the season's crop. For 150 years, the county's economy had rested on a three-legged stool: apples, melons, and alfalfa hay. The Hislop apple orchards covered nearly 9,000 acres on the northern slopes. The Ambrose sweet melon, a cantaloupe variety known for its high sugar content, was cultivated on 6,500 acres of prime bottomland along the Serpentine River. And the alfalfa, rich in protein, fed the dairy herds that produced 40% of the state's milk. These three crops were the county. They paid for the schools, the fire department, the sheriff's deputies. They were the reason the banks in the county seat of Harmony had a combined deposit base of over $300 million. And all three of them, every single blossom, depended entirely on the work of the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. The beekeepers of Ambrose County were not hobbyists. They were commercial pollinators, the unacknowledged bedrock of the entire regional economy. Men like Silas Croft, who was 64 years old and had managed bees for 41 of them, ran operations with thousands of hives. Croft apiaries managed 3,200 hives, which he leased out for pollination services. In early spring, his crews would move the white boxes into the apple orchards. The fee was $185 per hive. For a 200-acre orchard, a farmer might need 400 hives, a check written to Silas Croft for $74,000 before a single apple had set. 2 months later, the hives would move to the melon fields at $160 per hive. The bees were not a quaint feature of the landscape. They were a critical and expensive piece of agricultural machinery. In total, the pollination services in Ambrose County constituted a $4.2 million annual industry, which in turn supported a direct crop value estimated at over $88 million. The bees were the tiny, buzzing engine of it all. And in the spring of 2015, the engine began to sputter. It started quietly. A few beekeepers reported higher than normal winter losses. Instead of the typical 15% die-off, they were seeing 25 or 30%. The next year, it was 40%. By the spring of 2017, the county was in a state of quiet, existential panic. The term colony collapse disorder was spoken in hushed tones at the feed store and the diner. Hives that were thriving in October were found silent and empty by March, the queen and a few attendants left behind. The workers vanished. Silas Croft lost 1,100 of his 3,200 hives in the winter of 2016 to 2017. He found himself in the unprecedented position of being unable to fulfill his pollination contracts. The price per hive skyrocketed to $250, and still there weren't enough. For the first time since the Great Depression, apple farmers in the Hislop orchards watched as thousands of their blossoms withered on the branch, unvisited. The problem was diagnosed as a nectar dearth. For reasons no one could pinpoint, a strange combination of a dry spring, a cool summer, and the increasing prevalence of monoculture farming, the bees were starving. The wildflowers and clover that once filled the margins of every field, the fallows, the ditches, were disappearing, replaced by herbicide-resistant grasses and sterile lawns. After the main crops finished blooming, the bees found themselves in a floral desert. They went into winter malnourished, their immune systems compromised, and they simply didn't come out. The stool was losing a leg, and the entire county was beginning to wobble. This is when Ilara Vance enters the story. Ilara was 72 years old and had lived her entire life on a 114-acre farm on what was called Weaver's Ridge. The land had been in her family since 1888, purchased by her great-grandfather, a man who had kept meticulous journals about the soil, the weather, and the behavior of the wild things that lived there. Ilara had never married, had no children. She lived in the same small, white-painted farmhouse her grandfather had built. She was known in the community as a quiet woman, almost reclusive. She sold eggs and some vegetables from a small stand at the end of her gravel driveway, operating on the honor system. She was, to most people, a relic, a piece of the county's past, not its future. Her property was made of two distinct parts. There were 74 acres of good, flat pasture land where she kept a small herd of 20 Hereford cattle, and there were 40 acres of steep, rocky hillside. This hillside was covered in thin, acidic soil. It faced north, getting less sun. For decades, it had been considered the worst land on her farm, suitable only for the tough, scrubby pines and wild briars that clung to it. Her father had tried to graze sheep on it in the 1950s, but the forage was too poor. He had given up after 3 years. The 40 acres were, for all intents and purposes, worthless. In June of 2017, the Ambrose County Agricultural Commission, in a desperate attempt to address the bee crisis, did what committees do when faced with a problem they cannot solve. They hired a consultant. His name was Dr. Arlen Thorne. He was 38 years old, held a PhD in soil science from Cornell University, and was the lead agronomist for a multinational corporation called AgriSolutions. He arrived in a new Ford F250 with his company's logo on the side. He was confident, articulate, and came armed with technology. He had GPS-guided soil augers, portable spectrometers, and a laptop full of predictive models. For 2 weeks, he and his 2 young assistants crisscrossed the county, taking hundreds of soil samples. They mapped nutrient levels, pH, organic matter content, and water retention capacity down to the square meter. At the end of the month, the commission held a public meeting in the high school gymnasium. Nearly 500 farmers and beekeepers showed up. The air was thick with anxiety. Dr. Thorne stood at a podium in front of a large projection screen. He was dressed in a crisp polo shirt and khaki pants. He radiated an aura of calm, data-driven authority. For an hour, he presented his findings. He showed colorful maps of the county, shaded in reds and yellows, indicating phosphorus deficiencies and low nitrogen. He explained, in clear, simple terms, that the county's marginal lands, the fallows, the hillsides, the buffer zones, were nutritionally bankrupt. They couldn't support the diverse floral resources needed to sustain a healthy bee population through the late summer and fall. "Your problem," he declared, his voice resonating through the gymnasium sound system, "is not a bee problem. It is a soil problem." Then he clicked to a new slide. It was a topographical map of Weaver's Ridge, with one 40-acre parcel highlighted in a deep, angry red. "Let's take this as a case study," he said. "This parcel, on the Vance farm, is a perfect example of what we're up against." He listed the data points: a pH of 4.8, highly acidic, organic matter content, below 1%, severe compaction. "This soil," he stated, "is fundamentally broken. It is incapable of supporting high-value forage." He then unveiled the Ambrose Recovery Plan, a comprehensive county-wide strategy developed by AgriSolutions. The plan was simple. The county would subsidize the purchase of AgriSolutions' proprietary Pollinators Gold Clover Mix, a genetically engineered perennial designed for rapid growth and high nectar production. But to make it work, the soil had to be prepared. Thorne prescribed a heavy application of pelletized lime to raise the pH, followed by a dose of a specific NPK fertilizer, 10-20-20, to boost the nutrient levels. The total cost, he announced, would be $370 per acre, $220 for the seed, $150 for the amendments. The commission had secured a state grant that would cover half the cost for any participating farmer. It sounded impressive. It sounded scientific. It sounded like a solution. The floor was open for questions. After a few farmers asked about application timing and equipment, a woman stood up in the back row. It was Alara Vance. She was wearing a simple cotton dress and worn leather boots. She hadn't spoken a word to anyone since she arrived. In the sudden quiet, her voice was soft but clear. "The soil isn't broken," she said. Dr. Thorne squinted, trying to see her in the dim light. "I'm sorry, ma'am?" "My hillside," she said, her hands clasped in front of her. "That soil isn't broken. It's tired." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. Dr. Thorne managed a patient, slightly condescending smile. "I understand the sentiment," he said, "but our data is unequivocal. The spectrometry doesn't lie. The nutrient exchange capacity is critically low." "You read the land," Alara replied, her gaze steady. "You didn't listen to it." Thorne's smile tightened. "Ma'am, with all due respect, a lifetime of observation is a wonderful thing, but it is not a substitute for empirical, verifiable data. We are facing a county-wide economic crisis. We need solutions that are scalable and predictable, not anecdotal." Alara Vance said nothing more. She simply held his gaze for a moment, then sat down. The moment passed. The presentation concluded with a round of applause. The farmers, desperate for a plan, lined up to sign on for the subsidy. It felt like hope. Alara drove home in her 20-year-old pickup truck. When she got back to the farmhouse, she went to a bookshelf in the living room and took down a small, leather-bound volume. It was her great-grandfather's journal, dated 1890 to 1920. The pages were brittle, the ink faded. She turned to a section from 1905, the year of a great drought. Her great-grandfather had written about a field he had cleared on the same north-facing hillside. His words, penned in elegant cursive, seemed to speak directly across the 112 years. "The earth here is thin and sour. It gives back little. It asks only to be left alone. But we cannot afford that. When the land is tired and the season is hard, it needs a fast friend, not a rich one. Give it buckwheat. It asks for nothing and gives what it can. The bees will thank you for it, and their thanks is a sweeter thing than a heavy crop." The next morning, Alara Vance drove her truck into Harmony, but she didn't go to the county extension office to sign up for Dr. Thorne's plan. She went to the Ambrose Farmers Co-op, a dusty, cavernous building that smelled of feed and fertilizer. She found the manager, a man named George Cobb, and asked him if he could still get common buckwheat seed. Cobb, a man of 50 who had known Alara his whole life, looked surprised. "Buckwheat? Alara, nobody's planted that around here in 30 years. It's a poor man's crop. Doesn't build the soil much. The deer love it too much." "I know what it is," she said. "Can you get it?" He made a few calls. He found a supplier in Pennsylvania. The price was 90 cents a pound. She placed an order for 2,000 pounds, a full ton. The total came to $1,800. To pay for it, she went to the Harmony Savings and Loan and took out a small loan against her property, the first debt the Vance farm had carried since 1946. A week later, the seed arrived in 40 50-pound canvas bags. Her grandnephew Lucas, a 19-year-old who was studying agriculture at the community college, came to help. He had been at the meeting and was fully convinced by Dr. Thorne's presentation. He thought his great-aunt had lost her mind. "Aunt Alara," he said, hefting a bag onto the back of the ancient tractor, "Dr. Thorne said that soil needs lime and phosphorus. This is just throwing seed on a rock." "Dr. Thorne is a very smart man," Alara said, not looking at him as she calibrated the old seed drill. "But he thinks the solution to a problem comes in a bag he sells. Sometimes the solution comes in a bag you find." For 3 days, they worked on the steep 40-acre hillside. They didn't plow. They didn't add a single pellet of lime or fertilizer. They simply used a no-till drill to sow the tiny, pyramid-shaped buckwheat seeds directly into the thin soil among the rocks and scrub. It was backbreaking work. Lucas complained the whole time, convinced it was a fool's errand. When they were finished, the hillside looked no different than it had before, a barren, worthless piece of land. Dr. Thorne drove by once, slowed his truck, shook his head, and drove on. Let me tell you about buckwheat. Phagopyrum esculentum. It is not a true grain, but a pseudo-cereal more closely related to rhubarb and sorrel. It has been cultivated by humans for at least 6,000 years, but in the age of modern, high-input agriculture, it has been largely forgotten. Its virtues are subtle, and they are precisely the virtues that a soil spectrometer cannot measure. It grows incredibly fast, sprouting in 3 to 5 days and reaching maturity in just 10 to 12 weeks. Its dense canopy of heart-shaped leaves shades out weeds, acting as a natural herbicide. But its real magic is in its roots. Buckwheat roots exude mild acids that are remarkably effective at liberating phosphorus, a key nutrient for plant growth, from soil particles that would otherwise keep it locked away. It is a scavenger. It thrives in the very low fertility, acidic soils where crops like corn and Dr. Thorne's expensive clover would wither. It doesn't fix the soil in the way a legume does, by adding nitrogen. Instead, it unlocks the potential that is already there, however faint. It is, as Alara's great-grandfather had written, a fast friend to tired earth. Through July and into August, a strange thing happened. The Ambrose recovery plan was not recovering much. The weather remained odd. A period of heat was followed by unseasonable cool and heavy rains. The pollinator's gold clover, engineered for ideal conditions, struggled. It grew in patchy, anemic stands. What did grow produced few blossoms. The nectar dearth continued, worse than ever. The bees grew weak. Silas Croft watched his hives dwindle, the buzzing within them growing fainter each week. He was facing catastrophic losses. The mood in the county turned from hope to despair. On Weaver's Ridge, however, something else was happening. Alara Vance's buckwheat, the crop that asked for nothing, was thriving. It shot up, its thick stalks reaching 3 feet high, choking out the briars and scrub grass. By the second week of August, the entire 40-acre hillside, the slope that everyone had written off as worthless, was a dense, unbroken sea of green. And then it bloomed. The flowers of the buckwheat plant are not large or showy. They are tiny, delicate, and white, sometimes tinged with pink, and they grow in dense clusters. And they produce a staggering amount of nectar. A single acre of blooming buckwheat can support a hive of bees for a month. Alara's field had transformed the barren hillside into a 40-acre, all-you-can-eat buffet for pollinators, and it had opened for business at the exact moment when every other restaurant in town had closed. The bees found it within a day. At first, it was just a few scouts. Then they returned to their hives, and in the strange, vibrating dance that is the language of bees, they told the others where the feast was, and the others came. They came from Silas Croft's apiaries 3 miles to the east. They came from the hives of a dozen other beekeepers within a 5-mile radius. The air on Weaver's Ridge filled with a low, constant, living hum. Lucas, the skeptical grandnephew, stood at the edge of the field, his mouth agape. He had never seen or heard anything like it. It was a river of bees flowing into and out of the sea of white blossoms. One afternoon, Silas Croft drove his truck up Alara's long driveway. He was a man not given to emotion, his face weathered by decades of sun and bee stings. He got out, walked slowly to the edge of the field, and just stood there for a full 5 minutes, listening. The sound of tens of millions of bees, a sound he had feared he might never hear on a grand scale again, washed over him. Alora came out onto her porch and watched him. He finally turned, his eyes glistening. He walked over to the porch steps, took off his hat, and looked up at her. He said, "They found it." "I thought they might," Alora replied. "How did you know?" Silas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "All the experts, the computers, they got it wrong. How did you know?"
Laura just patted the worn wooden railing of the porch. "This place has a long memory," she said. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." The buckwheat bloomed for nearly a month. The bees gorged on the nectar.
They packed it into their hives, turning it into a dark, molasses-like honey with a strong, earthy flavor, quite unlike the light clover honey the market preferred. But the bees didn't care about the market. They cared about survival. They were filling their winter larder. In mid-September, the first frost came, and the buckwheat died back, its job done. Ilara didn't harvest the seeds. She let the dead stalks stand, a protective mulch for the tired soil. The unharvested seeds, a feast for winter birds. The 40-acre field had cost her $1,800 and 3 days of work. It had produced no cash crop. By any modern agricultural metric, it was a complete financial loss. The climax of the story did not happen in that field of flowers. It happened on October 24, 2017, in the same high school gymnasium at the fall meeting of the Ambrose County Beekeepers Association. The mood was grim. The reports from around the county were disastrous. The expensive clover had failed. Honey production was down 70%. Many beekeepers were talking about selling off their equipment, getting out of the business entirely. Dr. Alan Thorne was there. He had been invited back to explain why the Ambrose recovery plan had not worked. He stood at the podium and spoke of unprecedented weather patterns, of the clover's failure to establish itself, of the need for patience. He used phrases like suboptimal outcomes and data-driven reassessment. He was, in his own way, admitting failure without using the word. When he was finished, Silas Croft, the president of the association, walked to the podium. He was not an eloquent man. He held a single sheet of paper in his hand. He thanked Dr. Thorne for his report. Then he looked out at the assembled beekeepers.
"It was a bad year," Silas began, his voice flat. "For most of us, it was the worst year we've ever seen. The county-wide average surplus honey production, per hive, was 11 pounds. Most of you know that's not enough to get a colony through the winter without supplemental feeding." He paused, letting the weight of that number sink in. "But there's an exception," he continued. "We pulled data from the 18 apiaries, that's about 6,000 hives, located within a 3-mile flight radius of the old Vance farm on Weaver's Ridge." He looked down at his paper. The room was utterly silent. Dr. Thorne stood off to the side, a puzzled expression on his face. Silas Croft looked up again. "The hives near the Vance property," he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the silent room, "averaged an extra 28 pounds of surplus honey per hive." He held up a clear glass jar filled with a substance as dark as motor oil. "Buckwheat honey," he said. "It's not pretty, but it's heavy, and it's full of sugar. It's life." And in that number, 28, the sound of 10 million bees in a field of forgotten flowers was the entire argument. Let me tell you what 28 pounds of honey means. For a honeybee colony, it is the entire margin between life and death. It is the fuel they burn to keep the cluster warm through the freezing nights of January. It is the food that ensures the queen is healthy enough to begin laying eggs in the first days of spring. It is the difference between a hive that emerges in April, booming and ready to pollinate an apple orchard, and a silent, dead-out box of woodenware. For the 6,000 hives in the radius of Ilara's field, that extra 28 pounds meant a survival rate of nearly 90% through the winter of 2017 to 2018. The rest of the county saw survival rates below 40%, even with expensive supplemental feeding. Ilara Vance had not just saved some bees,
She had saved the productive capacity of nearly a third of the county's commercial hives. She had saved the Hislop apple crop for the following year. She had saved Silas Croft's business. She had spent $1,800 on the forgotten seed and in doing so had underwritten millions of dollars of the county's future. Dr. Alan Thorne did not argue. He did not question the data. He simply stood there looking from Silas Croft to the jar of dark honey, and for the first time since he had arrived in Ambrose County,
The look of supreme confidence had vanished from his face. He was a man who had brought a supercomputer to a fistfight and had lost to a ghost from 1905. His system, for all its precision, had a fatal flaw. It could measure the chemistry of the soil, but it could not measure its history. It could model nutrient uptake, but it could not model resilience. It saw a worthless parcel of land because its definition of worth was narrow and immediate.
It could not conceive of a solution that wasn't also a product to be sold. The aftermath unfolded slowly, as real change always does. The following spring, the Ambrose County Agricultural Commission quietly canceled its contract with AgriSolutions. Farmers, following the lead of Silas Croft, began planting buckwheat on their own marginal lands. Not because the county told them to, but because they had seen it work. They called it Ilara's clover. Lucas, the grandnephew, did not return to the community college that fall. He stayed on the farm, working alongside his great-aunt. He spent his evenings reading her great-grandfather's journals, filling a new notebook of his own with observations. The inheritance, the quiet knowledge passed down not through a will, but through practice, had found its next generation. 2 years later, Dr. Arlen Thorne left AgriSolutions and accepted a teaching position at a small land-grant university. He was, by all accounts, a different kind of teacher. He spoke less about predictive models and more about listening. He taught his students that the most important tool an agronomist has is not a spectrometer, but a pair of boots and the patience to walk a piece of land for a very long time. The bee population of Ambrose County stabilized, and then it began to recover. The nectar dearth had not gone away, but now there was a bridge across it. A 40-acre bridge of small white flowers that bloomed in the hungriest part of the year. 3 years after the buckwheat summer, the Hyslop apple orchards reported a 15% increase in yield, attributed to superior pollination. The three-legged stool of the county's economy was stable once more. Ilara Vance passed away in the spring of 2022, 5 years after her quiet act of defiance. She was 77 years old. She died in the same bed she had been born in the small white farmhouse overlooking the 40-acre hillside that was, at that very moment, being prepared by her nephew for another planting of buckwheat. Her funeral was held in the small church in Harmony. It was standing room only. Silas Croft, his face etched with age, stood up to speak. He didn't talk for long. "Some people," he said, "make a lot of noise, and in the end, it doesn't amount to much. And some people are very quiet, and their silence saves the world." The story of Ilara Vance and her worthless field is not really about farming. It is a story about two different ways of knowing the world. One is loud, fast, and confident. It comes from the outside, armed with data and charts. It believes in solutions that can be scaled, packaged, and sold. It seeks to correct nature, to impose a better design. It is the knowledge of the spreadsheet. The other way of knowing is quiet, slow, and patient. It is earned over generations, through observation and failure and small, incremental successes. It is passed down in handwritten notes in a faded journal. It does not seek to impose, but to listen. It believes that the solution to a problem is often already present in the place itself, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. It is the knowledge of the soil. The modern world is addicted to the first kind of knowledge. It is impressive, powerful, and profitable, but it is also brittle. Its solutions often create new, more complex problems. What survives over the long run, what endures through the droughts and the strange seasons, is the second kind of knowledge. It is not efficient, it is not scalable. It is rooted in a single place. It understands that a tired field, like a tired soul, does not need to be optimized. It needs to rest. And that the best medicine is sometimes a simple, forgotten flower, and the wisdom to know when to plant it.